Yeah, if you already got set up,
Well, I can.
we're here.
Let me just verify that the room is there. I'm not going to be able to. My client's not connecting to
Okay.
the server.
Not getting yourself.
We'll be able to talk about you. Monitor the room.
Right.
I mean,
That's all I'm doing.
Just be happy as long as you know.
No. You be happy for as long as I left.
Nothing.
That's true. I was just joking. And you thought it's
We'll definitely need John and Chris.
Well, while we're waiting for our presenter, there they come. Welcome. One of them at least, yes. Can I solicit a volunteer to take notes? Should be, I'm expecting a pretty easy job today.
I'm happy to do that. I'll take it.
Thanks, Adam. On your birthday even.
Technically, that was yesterday.
Well, technically yesterday, okay.
It kind of smears across time zone.
Yeah, it does. Thanks. Okay, well, this is Modern Working Group. If you're here for something else, you're welcome to stick around and have some fun. If you're expecting something else, you're in the wrong room. Here's a note that we have all seen many times. If you have anything that falls under this consideration, please take it under advisement. And the agenda. You want to talk to the agenda?
Sure. Start with administrivia, which doing right now. Oh, sorry. And the first discussion up is going to be about the framework document. I expect that to be very short because there were very few changes to it this time. The next is a second version of the Terry document from John Peterson. John Peterson will do both of those, and then Chris Wendt will talk about the new version of the drip draft, then open discussion. Any suggestions, changes, comments? Okay. With further ado, John, do you want to start out?
This is not facing a useful way. Is this on? Is working? Okay. They really do make these so you have to like talk directly into them here. Yeah, if I chip a tooth, I'm suing AMS. Okay. You have my good. I'm not going to sue AMS. Okay. So the good news is, after much trial and tribulation, we did manage to achieve consensus in this working group around our problem statement, which incorporates as well our framework and our use cases. And we happily issued an initial version of that immediately thereafter. And since that time, what I've done, I issued a very minor revision based on 2 sets of basically like nit reviews that I got. This went through several pre-working group adoption revisions of it, though. So for a 0.1, it's actually, I think, relatively mature in the sense of, I think it articulates pretty well what it set out to do. I suspect there's probably little to change here before working group last call. I'd be interested in hearing what people think should be changed before working group last call. But like I said, really the only feedback we've gotten since we issued that initial 00 IETF draft has been like NIT stuff. And so if there's something more to say, this would be a good time to say it. Otherwise, I would be looking to the chairs to say we should probably start considering progressing it. We did get a comment from Pierce on the list about this right after it was issued, in which Pierce said that we still don't get it. You know, I think this is a familiar discussion that Pierce and I had following that. I think Pierce thinks that a problem statement should be much more specific and even prescribing like an implementation. And as a consequence of that, I think it's a bit misaligned with really what the purpose is of this document. But it's kind of worth saying we did have that discussion. So if there are things people would like to say, people read the document, are interested enough in it to have some comments on it, I'd be happy to discuss it. But I'm going to close this door while you get Richard, sorry.
Richard Shockey, you've heard my objections to the problem statement a long time. They've been consistently ignored. I intend to try and keep my mouth shut as long as possible. End of statement.
Again, I think understood. So I know that there are fundamental disagreements that are more with the charter in the sense of any document that has this property will be disagreeable. But I mean, I do want to say, Richard, we're not here to squelch discussion about what is within the scope of the working group. And I'd like to think I've not ignored comments that you've made about this. I think we
Richard Shockey, again, I think you actually have ignored, and the area directors have ignored, legitimate comments about the way the charter and what the problem framework ultimately looks like here. And I'm not objecting to the work proceeding. Let me make that perfectly clear. I'm objecting to the direction that the work is dealing with a problem statement that does not actually solve issues that we actually see within the network.
And I know, Alyssa, you can speak to that, but maybe I'll say something first just to that, which is that, you know, again, we all remember, and, you know, we can have a history lesson every time we come here, you know, how this started, what the workshop was that kicked this off, and what the scope of that exercise was. And it's true that the scope of that exercise was not to do what you just said. It was not to solve some pressing industry problem in the way that I think you're describing. It was to look experimentally at what a post-IP transition world might look like and what kinds of tools might be appropriate for that.
But the focus has ignored the perfectly legitimate issue that we have in the network on how to provide metadata across the network, not just on the issuance of numbers, but on how to actually provide sort of useful things, like metadata involving how we deal with IP interconnection, for instance. So my statement at this particular point is I have no objection for everyone having a lovely little sandbox to continue to go on with this sort of stuff. But it is vitally important that the public record indicates that some of us still have very, very large problems with this. And, you know, I'm happy to just sit down and be quiet.
I'm serious, Richard. I don't want you to sit down and be quiet. I want your help to get, so here we have this management operation. We're going to talk about this when we talk about Terry. I think the management operation exists to fulfill precisely the function that you just described. It may be that this does more than what you want, things in addition to what you want. But I think with your help, Richard, if we talk about what that management interface should look like, we will be able to address the problem you're identifying.
The problem set that I'm trying to deal with is orthogonal to the problem set that you have insisted over the objections of myself and I believe several others to try and ultimately address. A generic framework for dealing with telephone number metadata is actually a useful thing. And by the way, this has nothing to do with enum. I am the first person to say, and I have said on the list multiple times, you know, the enum was a problem. 12, 15 years ago when we did it, it was the best technology we had available. The generalized framework of a client server-like relationship that dealt with telephone number metadata in a general case should have been the ultimate way this working group should have been chartered. However, it was not, because my objections and the objections of others were totally, absolutely, and completely ignored by the area directors.
So
Hi, I'm Alyssa Cooper, one of the area directors, said area directors. So first of all, I will disagree with your characterization that your comments were ignored. Ignoring is like, I received the email, I read it, I delete it, and I never respond. Your comments were not ignored. We had an extended debate, not just with you, but with many people, about what the scope of the work should be in this working group. And again, the process for chartering a working group, as Adam Roach has reminded us time and time again, involves determining whether there is a properly scoped piece of work in which there is sufficient interest to make progress in the IETF. It does not involve obtaining uniform consensus that everyone agrees that there should be this work in the IETF. There's a difference between how we decide to charter something and how we decide to progress an actual document. So here we are at the place where we're talking about an actual document. And I guess my question to you is, within the bounds of the existing modern charter, if there is any problem statement or framework that could be written to which you would not object on its face.
I believe the charter was too narrowly scoped from the beginning, and my objections to the narrow scope were ignored by the area directors and the ISG. That has been my problem from the beginning. The larger issue here is a framework for something I actually do agree with, which is a larger construct that provides, both a client server as well as a distributed environment for a variety of metadata associated with telephone numbers, which in fact, I believe has vastly larger support. However, given the way this working group was chartered and the way you specifically and the area directors and the IESG ignored our scoping questions, actually degrades the ability of this working group to progress something useful forward.
So if I might, Richard, just done that before, or by all means, area director, respond to that for me if you would like to.
So is your answer to my question no?
We will allow this, not we. Well, actually, for some of us, it is a question of we. There is no, if people want to do work, good, that's fine. But I'm perfectly happy to provide a plastic pail and a plastic little shovel. And if you want to sandbox this in a particular way without actually providing something useful, as well as not providing something useful which is deployable, especially among the people who actually use telephone numbers in a rational fashion, namely, I'm saying service providers, not just in North America, but on a worldwide basis, then you want to deal with the issue, the problem of issuance of telephone numbers, that's fine. But I don't see way too many national regulatory authorities in the room. And since the issuance of telephone numbers is a plenary authority of the national regulatory authority, the way this has been scoped severely damages its applicability in the network.
So I think what I'm hearing is that there is no work that can be done within the current scope of this charter to which you would not object. That's, right, because if to understand how objections work, right? There's sort of two paths, which we've talked about before on the list. One is if we cannot get consensus to carry any of this work forward, then we can think about rechartering or closing the group or something, right? That's like there's no work that can be done that has consensus, versus there is possibly some work that could be done that could get consensus under the current charter. And I'm just trying to understand which one of those paths could potentially be acceptable to you, and it sounds like only one of them is.
Actually, not at all. I'm actually trying to be reasonable in this situation, which is I have no fundamental objection with the current charter work going forward as stated. However, I do want to say the following, which is the usefulness of this work is already severely constrained and in fact damaged beyond repair because it has limited its scope to such a limited problem statement versus the larger problem statement of how we deal with metadata about phone numbers.
Sorry, I was getting bored.
So how many beers did you have, Cullen? Obviously. Really, we can work on that privately, by the way. I believe that the scope of this working group within the IETF has been damaged. However, I believe that there is enough limited hope that a framework for this class of protocol can be useful in a larger context. But since the charter never recognized the true scope of what we're dealing with, you have boxed yourself into a very, very difficult position, which is, I think, not applicable to the way telephone numbers are currently used and what we actually need to do in the future to make something like this useful. And I have a unfortunate history with phone numbers, okay? And that is well understood here. And by the way, I'm actually on the North American Numbering Council, so I'm not representing the FCC here, but I am a part of the technical advisory committee that actually recommends to the FCC how telephone numbers are actually issued. And I do understand the terms, control, and regulation by which phone numbers are actually issued in a service provider context. And there is a construct there that, at least for the time being, I believe most people are somewhat happy with, but we need to move metadata about phone numbers around here and there. How the phone number itself is issued is a minor problem compared to the larger issues of metadata acquisition, distribution, circulation, one way or the other. That's my
And if
Yes,
I'd like to
I
get in on
have
this,
an
but-
idea of what you might say, but thanks. That was helpful. I got the information that I needed from my side, so I appreciate that.
why don't we talk about Terry a bit? Because I think in that context, I will challenge you, Richard, to see if you think there is not something that could be done exactly within the space you're describing with the framework that we're proposing to create here. And I think that there probably is. So Terry is something we haven't actually talked about in a little bit. Until we had consensus around a problem statement, I thought there was probably limited value in actually exploring like what the proposal would be, given that at least we managed to get a working group item around the problem statement and its associated framework. I thought it was worth taking another look at this and probably trying to make the alignment changes that the modifications to the problem statement that came about in its last few revisions that did seem to get the consensus of the group would result for in the Terry model. Now that much said, I just issued this like right before this, and there's been like no list discussion about it yet. I didn't really make any effort to like kick off list discussion about it. I think having this tutorial opportunity, which is basically what I'd like to use this time for, is probably the best that we could hope for. I'm sure we're over time from the original 5 minutes we had to discuss the first draft, so I'll try to go through this as quickly as I can. So yeah, what is Terry? This is basically the concept that we should have an information model that contains information related to telephone numbers, metadata, in fact. Some of it's service data, some of it is administrative data, and it's going to exist in these things that are called Terry records. And these records will be provisioned at services, and they'll be accessible and mutatable at these services. And exactly what those services are and who runs them and what the policy implications of any of this are, the technology is utterly agnostic to in every way. And by design, this is designed to work both in kind of static, centralized, familiar looking environments, as well as more radical environments like things that, like DRIP that Chris is exploring. The fundamental building block of it is the record. What we decided though is to consolidate all of this. I was actually looking at doing like separate documents and protocols that would involve the acquisition interface versus the management interface versus the retrieval interface. Really, I'm focusing just much more on the record and looking at these operations as being kind of a secondary and simple problem to solve compared to what the records should be. Next slide. So like I said, there are 3 things that we envision you could do with this. And Richard, I get that acquisition operation, not your favorite. I think, again, by acquisition operation, though, we probably mean something different than you think. We aren't necessarily talking about a national regulator like giving out numbers. We're thinking about things like one of Cullen's PBXs being able to give out numbers to one of his phones. This is an interface that has applicability to a very wide variety of things that I think fall outside the scope of the national authorities that you're describing. There are systems today that make use of numbers like this. I can point to many systems that have this property today. There are protocols that you use to go access Google for Google Voice to say, I'd like to get a telephone number from your service. There are, or one that we've talked about quite a bit has been 800 RESTworks. And the way that you go to something that's very much like a registrar and you say, I'd like to purchase an 800 number, and then you take that and you give it to a service provider. These are things that address practical use cases that exist in the network today. Now, I'm not going to argue that the acquisition operation is the most crucial dimension of this. I think I agree with you, actually, that management and retrieval are more interesting in terms of most of the things that we need to do, and that's where most of the metadata you're interested in is going to get provisioned, is in that management interface. But that doesn't mean that having a story about this overall life cycle doesn't make sense for us. There are practical things you can do with an acquisition operation. And kind of the fundamental insight we had, you remember I started first working just on retrieval alone in this proposal called Turk. I think the fundamental insight we had is that all 3 of these are going to operate on a base set of data that's going to be basically the same. And that as a consequence of this, it was really defining that record as a fundamental building block. And kind of once you do that, you just look at these as all operations that deal with records. Next slide, please. And the big ideas behind this are there are going to be clients and services. There are some cases like a client will do an acquisition from a service. Again, that could be like Cullen's IPPBXs there. There are going to be cases where clients want to be able to retrieve something from a service, from a CSP that has records that are warehoused somewhere. One of the things that's different about this model, it's different from enum that we think is an improvement, at least I hope it is, and this helps to enable DRIP-like models like that Chris is considering, is the fact that it is authorities that are specifically designated as actors in this whole infrastructure who create records, and that the trust that clients have in the records is based on the authorities typically, rather than the service from which they're acquired. And that enables these radically distributed architectures where in fact you could have all kinds of things that are services that you could get these from, where you don't even have to trust the service necessarily. The record that you get from it, you'll be able to verify that record because of the authority who generated it. And that's actually the biggest single difference, I think, between the way we thought about enum and the way that we're thinking about this. Next slide. Yeah, so we've defined a bunch of these operations for acquiring and managing and retrieving and so on. Each one is composed of a request and response, all operate again on this core building block, the Terry record. I can talk a bit about roughly how we sketch out these messages to look, but we're defining this again as an abstract information model that's operating on these. We're not actually proposing a particular protocol even that'll carry these requests and responses at the moment. We imagine there are going to be a variety of different bindings that could do that. You could do this with JSON, you could do this with things that are more lightweight, but we're definitely looking at a more diverse environment than just kind of the DNS as a query protocol, and how can we figure out how to cram like all the things we need to get into a query into the DNS and all the things we need to get into a response in order to enable the kinds of applications people generally want to do with these on the internet. even in the NNIs that have a lot of requirements for what kind of data, metadata you'll get about the numbers, but also how many attributes and conditions you want to place on the request. Next slide. This, I think, kind of goes through most of what I just said about making cherry records available as services, that the fact they can be distributed, they can look like things like DRIP. One thing that I did do in this revision that is different from the previous revision is actually took the actors that we enumerated in the modern framework and tried to map them onto the entities that we see here. So I imagine Terry clients will consist of things like in the modern framework, users, CSPs, government entities. There'll be people that are sending these retrieval requests, for example. Services will typically be registries, registrars, and CSPs. Those of you playing the home game may recall the big change that seemed to finally get some consensus around the modern framework and problem statement in the first place was we made it look much more DNS-like in that there are now registries and registrars and the distinction between them. Next slide. And this is just kind of a refresher of what we actually put into that modern framework to describe who the actors are and what kinds of things they're interested in. At the time, we kind of added registrars to it. And one of the interesting components of the model when we created that at the time was that CSPs can be registrars or not. And so we kind of imagined a world where a communication service provider, a traditional carrier, could be someone who would get would get a block of numbers from a registry, something very much like the way this works today in something like the NAMPA. And they would then in turn act as a registrar, doling out those numbers to their customers. But in a different architecture, like the REST-org architecture for 800 numbers, it might be the case that there is a registrar that is decoupled from a communication service provider, where you go to this third-party entity, say, I'd like to buy an 800 number, and then you bring that number to a particular CSP. And so introducing that bit of modularity into the architecture seems to have been the thing that managed to get a lot of people thinking about this in a more practical fashion, right? That this was more tractable to problems that we actually have today in the way that the network is administrated. You want to talk about it, Richard?
Richard Shockey again. You are delving into what I think is you're wading into an area which bothers me considerably, which is policy, which is the policy for the acquisition of telephone numbers is determined by a national regulatory authority. In the case of the United States, that's under the authority of Section 251E1 of the Communications Act of 1996. And the actors here, which is you correctly have numbering authorities as number one, but you are postulating issues by which somehow would be outside the scope of the policy prerogatives to which a national regulatory authority might or might not have. And what I was hoping for when this working group was initially chartered was there was a framework for technology and technology only, without necessarily describing use cases that would impinge upon the prerogatives a national regulatory authority would ultimately have, which is instead of dealing with specific use cases on allocation, we were looking at a generic technology that would finally once and for all kill the Enum beast, which I am perfectly happy to subscribe to one way or the other. But the generic larger issue of dealing with metadata could have been more useful if the scope were more narrowly defined or in this case expanded, which is I have no problems with the fact that a third-party service provider might actually use this technology to potentially distribute phone numbers under the appropriate authority of a national regulatory agency, one way or the other. But that is ultimately a larger policy issue, and we're trying to provide choices, not restrictions.
Well, again, I think we are providing options. I don't think there's
Not the
anything
way
here.
the charter was written.
I don't think there's anything here that constrains or obligates a national authority or registry to do anything. I think that we are creating a set of tools, precisely the way you described, that can be utilized for a variety of fashions. Now, I've given a couple of concrete examples of the allocation of the acquisition mechanism that I think I would be surprised if you disagreed to the principle that those are not matters that the numbering authority, a national regulator, is a party to. If Cullen's PBX is allocated a set of numbers, right, that he gets from Verizon or something, and he wants to, through this, acquisition interface, allow telephones to connect to his PBX to acquire them, surely that's not something that the numbering authority has any interest in even, right?
That is a secondary use case.
Well, no,
Highly
no,
secondary use case,
Yeah,
not
but-
the primary use case.
Well,
The primary use case is the structure of how the resource is ultimately allocated. Plus, you have ignored generally the ultimate problem that some of us have had in especially the 800 case,
Yeah.
which is the identity of the underlying. I don't want to get into an 800, Sonos discussion about the problems with the 800 service as a facilitator of things like robocalls and spoofing.
Actually, I'm profoundly interested in those. And I think the system does help us.
The problem
address
is also one of the issues in terms of policy that you have to deal with is the identity ultimately associated with the underlying telephone number, which we are not going to deal with because that involves endless issues that none of us want to go to one way or the other, and nor should we go to.
that. Actually, I believe those are in scope of this work, and I think it will look like
it is
you know.
not clear to some of us.
it'll look like weirds. It'll look like. That's Chris.
So I think, in some of the early meetings, we talked about this as a data modeling exercise. And I really do think that is where we are at this point. Adding the registrar's things we talked about, that was an important thing. But maybe, unfortunately, it sort of seems like policy gets involved here because there is that first bullet item. But the data modeling exercise is to look at all the use cases and try to map that into a common set and hope, cross our fingers that it all can work out and we can have a consistent interface for all those things and we don't have to have too many corner cases and et cetera, But
And to be
I
clear,
think the purely technical thing here is that we need to look at the system the way it works, think about what the future things may want to happen. And if they all come down to the same data model, then to me, that makes a lot of sense.
and there is a lot of hazard tape in the problem statement and framework about that numbering authority and how the numbering authority is not an actor in the actual protocol flows. I mean, except insofar as there are some like PTTs or whatever, where the registry that serves as the root of number allocation in a particular jurisdiction is literally composed with the numbering authority that's like one with the government or whatever in this instance. There are cases like that. But aside from that, again, the registry role is logically distinct from the numbering authority. And the numbering authority does not play a part in the acquisition interface things we're talking about here, in the sense of they set the policies, right, that the registries use to operate and dole things out to carriers who would act as registrars in this instance, who in turn dole things out to end users. And I mean, I think this is, so I don't think it's actually susceptible to precisely the objection that
Yeah, I mean, the number authority essentially in the end will likely provide a key that will allow you to enter data and sign that data or however we.
for the original registry, it'll have its bootstrap or whatever to this. That would be the idea. But again, nothing is prescribed in any of this about what the numbering authority does or what their policies are. This is a set of tools, and we use this set of actors to try to explain the overall problem space in which these tools could be exercised.
Alyssa Cooper, in the document, you do sort of define authority as a logical actor, though. So that might be something for clarification. that you
So
could
it's
think
interesting.
about.
Yeah, this is one of the places where, so if you're talking about the Terry document as opposed to the modern problem framework.
Right, which
So
is
the
what you're
interesting-
talking about, right?
Yeah, it is. So, well, no, so I specifically said this slide is taken from the modern problem framework. not
Oh,
from-
fair enough. Okay,
Yeah, so
sorry.
there is still a disconnect, and this is one of the things I've not ironed out yet, between numbering authorities, that technical term is used in the framework, and authority, which is used in a much broader sense in the Terry document. And yeah, I know that is a terminology bug, basically, it still needs to be fixed in this.
Okay.
Because, I mean, Terry just uses these concepts like, you grant authority, right, through delegation or something, and then someone gains some amount of authority for the number through that delegation. Yeah, that's a bug. That is a known bug to me anyway. So next slide. Yeah, I mean, again, I started thinking about this from a life cycle perspective. This was, again, one of the things that I think differentiated the way that I originally thought about Turk from what we ended up with in Terry. I guess I realized looking at drinks and looking at spearmint, and looking at all the efforts that had kind of been decoupled from enum, there was always just this like misalignment between what it was that you were going to be able to do with enum and then what the provisioning or management systems that were associated with it were going to be. And the consequence of that was this became a life cycle consideration. And that's one of the reasons why allocation is in the scope of it. We want to be able to look at how these records as atomic entities that are kind of injected into the cloud maybe of distributed entities that are acting as services in this instance, how records enter that, how records get modified in it, and how people can retrieve the contents of those records. So I think of this basically in SCRUD terms. There are some things about that we'd actually need to discuss as we go down this technical path that relate to kind of how authorities can potentially modify or delete records for subordinate authorities. This would be a case where, say, if the registry wants to reclaim resources from the registrar, like what would that look like in that instance? And in those hierarchical cases, there may be some hard edges. Next slide. We've talked, I guess, about all these operations. I kind of break down here in more detail what I imagine the bare minimum kind of set of data that every query and response for the operations would need to have in it. This won't give you a whole lot of insight into what I imagine the metadata, right, is about these numbers that we're looking for. This is just the stuff that needs to be there to make sure these things get routed, that they can actually target requests and so on at services. But just flip through this, and then the next two, management. So, I mean, the distinctions really between these are that in the acquisition interface, the likely successful sunny day responses, you get back a Terry record, and you will gain some amount of authority in that looser sense of authority that's in Terry for the telephone number in question. For management, you have a record IT that you would have gotten through the acquisition interface. You can use that ID to be able to modify, delete, whatever the records that you previously gained authority for. And then finally, in the retrieval operation, you don't know things like record ID. You just have a subject. This is the search component of it. And what you get back from a successful response will be one or more Terry records. And again, those records are likely to be trusted on the basis of the signing authority rather than the basis of the service from which you acquired them. Next slide. This goes into a little more detail about what kinds of thing I imagine would be in any Terry record. One important thing to get in this is that we're dividing it into service and administrative data. Service data is much more the things you would traditionally imagine to get from a retrieval interface from enum, for example. This is data that lets you figure out how to communicate with the entity that is behind that number or related functions to that. Whereas administrative data is much more the data that government entities, for example, might be interested in, who-is-ish or weirds-ish like data that'll be made available in these cases. And I've heard a lot of interest in that as a use case, especially from people that are government entities that are out there. This is not something, again, when we were doing the drinks and spearmint sort of stuff that I think we really thought through quite this way, that the numbers lifecycle would include that as well. But there's a lot of policy out there that would require it. Next slide. So far I've done a little bit of thinking about like what the record elements are. As I talk about this though to the room, these are the places where, and I hate to just keep calling on you, Richard, but I have to keep calling on you. So what we really need to understand, and what if you want to help, and whether or not you want to help is up to you, right? But if you want this to be something that can actually be used as a management interface for these anonymized cases you care for, what we need to know are the set of elements that need to be present in these records. These records are designed to be extensible. In the base model, we are only going to figure out, the simplest things we think you're always going to need, but it's going to be these individual use cases of this, like sharing metadata in an NI context that would dictate what this record set would be. And like I can make some stuff up, But the people who actually know this, they're in this room, right? And if there's a problem that this solves, even if you never implement the acquisition interface, if you read the Terry spec, nothing requires you to even implement it, right? You could do this entire thing only implementing the management and the retrieval interfaces for this. Now, again, this is like a straw man. This is not even intended to be, what I think something like NNI might need. It roughly tracks the kinds of things that we put into drinks and spearmint. But if you're serious about the fact there is a need in the industry for this is a working group where we're trying to have this discussion, right? We're creating data structures that should enable this to be shared. And if there's a real problem here, I would like to challenge you to contribute, right? Help us figure out what should go in this, and we can try to address this industry problem. Now, it doesn't have to be a second, right? I'm not going to put you on the spot and say, get up and tell me this or that, but I do really want to try to get us across. I am trying to address that problem with this. And the scope of the charter, whatever you think about it, it may go further than you want it to, but the heart of it is in getting these record elements right and being able to mutate them and retrieve them. That's the problem we just set out to do. That's how I understand the charter. That's what's in the framework and the problem statement. This is what I'm trying to do. And, like I said, so I'm not trying to put you on the spot. Okay, Richard is saying.
Well, and that's a general call to everybody to contribute.
I said there are a lot of people in this room who have this information. It's not just you. There are people on the mailing list, and I see a few of them behind me that have this information. If this is a pressing industry problem, this is the way to address the problem. Why don't we do it? Is my proposition. If we don't want to do it, right? If this isn't something people are interested in doing, let's just let's close the group. Go home. Right? What? Oh yeah, you want to jump up and say close the group. Well, so then you'll find your other way to address the industry problem, I guess. Chris, what do you think?
So I think we have some things to contribute. I actually have a different problem where I'd love the scope of the working group to go beyond telephone numbers and address some of the other things we're talking about, or at least have that vision.
Well, these element types are going to be extensible. And as you see, there are URIs, there are domain names, there are,
Yep. So.
Next slide. I already said all that enough. You need to again. But at the end of the day, right, we're defining this information model to make this concrete, to make this actually implementable. At some point, we will then define some set of bindings and profiles. Now, these profiles will be specific to specific deployment environments we're targeting for Terry. So something like sharing metadata over the NNI would be one. Something like DRIP might be another. There are STIR-like use cases I'm interested for that I think this could support. Once we figure out what we want to do with that, we'll figure out for each of those environments what the right kinds of encodings and transports will look like for those profiles, and we'll call those bindings. And the profiles define kind of the extensions, what the elements will be. The bindings will define how you encode it and transport it. That's the plan. Next slide. So next step. Yeah, so there hasn't been a lot of this discussion about this. Let's be frank, there's been none. If we're going to engage on this, yes, we need some bodies who are willing to engage on it. That's partly on me in the sense of, first of all, I've been waiting on the problem statement to get enough approval that I thought it was worth starting this discussion and going forward with it. And also because STIR, let's frankly say it has taken up a lot of the energy of myself and Chris and people like that who are interested in getting something done here. And some of the oxygen left the room because of that. But as we're looking at that now, getting to a different phase where we think we have some maturity of the specifications there, I think there's an opportunity to get into some of the use cases. DRIP would be one, STIR would be another, and do something. And I think looking towards adoption of this eventually as a working group item. I'm not certainly asking about that today, but I hope I have at least today been able to illustrate that there is an industry problem, at least one, that I think this addresses. I am unable at least to distinguish this problem from a problem that people are telling me exists in the NNI. And I'm happy to work on it. And if people don't want to work on it, I've got other stuff to do. I can go do that. I really do. So any further comments on this?
Just have just one question on Bobby Flame. For civil and law enforcement authorities, public safety agencies, we already have a problem with attribution and making sure we serve legal process to the right party. So with this new system, who do we go to?
So the registrar is how it's defined in the framework. In the sense,
Okay.
so the registrar, much like a registrar in the DNS world, right, is going to be the entity that has the information about the customer, typically speaking. Now, the registrar in this instance is usually, for traditional telephone networks, composed with the CSP, with the carrier. So it would be the same thing. You would go to the carrier and say, you know, here's the number I have a problem with. Who's the person on the other side of it, since they're your customer.
Because a lot of times right now with the DNS system, I'm asking because we have problems with the registrars and the registries and more like a digital chain of custody.
Mhm.
Sometimes they're not maintaining, you know, the records, it's inaccurate. We kind of, you know, bounce, you know, back and forth. So I'm hoping with this model be maybe just a little bit more definitive, just so that when we do have the legal process, you know exactly who to go to, and it's not like a whole chain effect where we get sent from one, you know, from one place to another.
So we are pretty specific in this, although the registrar, again, might not necessarily be the same person as the service provider for the number, that the registrar has the information. And that is an obligation that this architecture very strongly puts on the registrar.
Okay. And one more question, who accredits the registrar? Like, where are they getting their authority to do it?
So the registry typically has some accreditation or policy system. I mean, we're vague about this because this is very different, right, in different environments. But yeah, it would be at the discretion of the registry, who ordinarily in these architectures would get their policy in turn from the numbering authority.
One more question then. Who's accrediting the registry then? Where is that authority coming from?
Again, I think the registry effectively is blessed directly by the numbering authority.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
I do want to emphasize, but please stay, by the way, because your questions, by the way, are excellent and directly involve the problems that the National Regulatory Authority has to address in dealing with the numbering plan. Typically, in the case of law enforcement, you first of all have to determine the carrier of record. And then once you've determined the carrier of record, then you can make a phone call or some electronic communication with the carrier of record to find out who actually has the phone number. The problem that we have, and I'm only going to speak to this in the North American context, is that telephone numbers have been delegated in multiple spheres, and our fine friends on 12th Street have not necessarily policed that very well. This is unusually prevalent in the 800 number space. The problem with arrest board is it may have gone through not only primary, secondary, but tertiary elements one way or the other. There is, in fact, like I said, my issue here is that if this was more genericized and did not really deal with, you know, phone number allocation itself, and we were looking at a better way of dealing with telephone number metadata that would provide our law enforcement agencies and other fine folks who desperately need to translate the phone number into an identity to catch the bad guys from time to time, we would all be happier. A greater focus on that as a use case versus secondary, tertiary use cases from other applications would in fact be helpful. So I don't object to this work generically. I've had certain history with this in terms of the enum context. So everything you said is right.
Okay, we're gonna cut the line with people who are up now. We'll let Eric. We'll let Eric go first. He's on the queue. Go.
Hi, Eric.
Go ahead, Eric.
Just a short one here. What the responding back up from the delegation, as opposed to just you really should do it.
You're kind of breaking up there. Did somebody get that?
I could not understand now. Could you repeat it, Eric?
Eric, was that question, what is ensuring that the registrar knows the delegation that goes down the line as opposed to just saying that you have to do it? Yeah, that's it.
Good.
Right. So if you read the framework document, it talks a lot about the distinction between an assignee and a delegate. And the basic concept behind it, again, is that the registrar's responsibility, is insofar as it manages the assignee, and this trickles down such that delegates are required to maintain that to update the registrar in much the same sense that like when you buy domain names and they trickle down, like you get hate mail from ICANN basically today that says like the contact information that's associated with this is not valid and it needs to be updated and we need to go through all these procedures to do it. Now again, that is a policy, and we are not here to define policy. I can say that the technology accommodates a variety of policy options that would have that consequence, but I don't want to get caught in this like catch-22, where if I can't articulate what the policy is, then there's a problem. I think the technology accommodates a variety of policies that will solve that, but it is up to the national authorities and other the CSPs and so on that are involved in this to determine exactly what the policy is for the application of this to a given use case.
Thanks.
Brian Rosen, a couple things. One is that the slides and the document diverge a bit in that they don't talk about some of the things you're raising here about what you might call a delegation chain.
Mm-hmm.
And that we're very interested in maintaining the fact that there is more than one step in a delegation chain. That the authority over the number changes. There are multiple levels of that, and the canonical existing one of national number authority to authorize carrier to resell to a secondary carrier to an enterprise to an individual user is representable in the data structures that we're talking about, and we don't always say that, and we probably need to say that more often. I did want to reinforce something I've said several times that I don't actually think is here. I guess I didn't look at the latest draft to see whether it came in, but I'm very interested in making sure that we do not make the assumption that there is only one service provider, one service on a number, right?
Yeah.
We can have different services on a number and they may have different providers. And we have to think about the effect of that on this previous discussion, chain of authority, delegation, and things like that. So that complicates life, and I think we need to spend some more time on that. And I'd be willing to put some effort into that.
Okay, so we do call that out actually specifically in the framework. That exact language is in there.
In framework, yes.
Yes.
In framework,
So what
yes.
it says in Terry that mirrors that is again that there may be multiple authorities that can publish records that either individually or through a range capture the same telephone number. That is literally the way that is reflected in the model.
Okay, so maybe we ought to have some explicit text that talks about, maybe an example is the way to do that, where you've got.
Again, we're running this fine line. It's so interesting because of the policy thing, right?
Yes.
It's like I made that's a
Yeah,
very generic
okay,
technical
okay,
tool
all
that
right,
I just
yes.
described.
Yeah.
That could be used to do all of a wide range of different policies, right?
Yeah.
And so I hesitate to be too prescriptive about it. We could say as an example,
Yes,
that
as
could
an
enable
example.
something like
This
this.
sounds like a really good conversation for the list.
Okay.
And the
that-
list
that
is
would be
really
fine.
lonely right now, so
Yeah.
the conversation would be really good there.
Okay, good, good, good.
For anybody on there. All right, are we set? Does anyone have any more comments on this? Again, I would love to hear that people think that this is actually solving their problem. I hope it can. I think it does. I really think it does. Okay, but I think Chris is going to be helpful.
So I did a update to the document. This is the second version. I wasn't planning on going through a full overview, but I'll say a few words at least to make sure everybody's on the same page. So DRIP is Distributed Registry Protocol. The idea here is that you have a distributed mechanism, a protocol that allows for nodes under different ownership to be in sync with a single set of data. So there's nothing in here that references, Terry or any other thing. It's meant to be generic, but it does have the property that would most likely be used in the context here where there isn't a single owner and everybody has equal ability to update and have a consensus. There can be policy within the data model itself that can be enforced, but this is purely the protocol that syncs the different nodes in the network. It uses a pretty common gossip protocol and incorporates voting mechanisms to make sure everybody's in sync with the updates that are happening, and there's no race conditions and there's no conflicting updates happening. Next page. So I wanted to, this is sort of a new line of thinking that I hadn't had before, and just making sure that we did an explicit comparison of what exists, because actually, if you're at all in the cloud world and container world, there's actually some interesting projects going on with similar scope. etcd and console are two that are used in the cloud world that are mechanisms for passing JSON data around. And the question I had was, oh, well, could we use that and call it a day? The one major difference here is that those protocols, so one happens to use one called Raft and another uses one called Surf. They do distributed consensus, but they have a master-slave or a leader relationship. So actually, I'm going into the next slide. And like I said, in DRIP, we explicitly avoid any leader because the intention is, so like in the etcd world or this lead master-slave relationship thing, typically that's deployed in a single network where you're managing all the nodes and you want to make the consensus happen quicker because you sort of control the network environment. Whereas we, in the case of DRIP, we're explicitly intending to make consensus full consensus. Every node has to have a vote in order to make sure that any update, there's no conflict, and to make sure that the data is consistent. So, and I think I stated that last time, so the goal here really is not necessarily to have the fastest protocol for consensus, it's to be the most accurate. So that's baked into the design and a big difference between some of the existing distributed systems that are out there in open source projects. Next page. So for 01, I completed all the TBDs that were in the document. So there's APIs and API examples for all the components now. I also addressed the security, and I can talk about this a little bit. So the security here is around node-to-node communication. So it's only intended to be, if you're going to be a peer node to me, I better know that you are the person that you are, talking to me. So we incorporated a authorization header, including standard JWT certificate-based, I would assume would be the best mechanism here, so that whatever node provider could have their own certificate and identify themselves. And that happens for every node-to-node transaction. So every API call will include this authorization header, and that's pretty standard practice, actually. Eric, you have a comment?
I was actually going to wait, since this is this last slide, I wanted to jump in at the end.
Okay.
Thanks.
Sure. So that authorization is actually different than the authority validating transactions. So for example, like we said, an authority might have you may have a separate set of certificates that represent the ability for you to actually allocate a number or change the information on a record or whatever. So that would not be part of this protocol. That would sit in the data model itself and be part of Terry or whatever. So that, just to make sure it's clear, that is a separate set of concerns. Lastly, I added a heartbeat mechanism for each node to validate. So this was another TBD as part of the document. So the heartbeat is really mostly something where I'm sitting there and I may have no network connectivity, and I don't know that I don't have no network connectivity. So at some point I need to determine that, hey, nobody can talk to me, I'm not getting updates, so therefore I really have to put myself into inactive mode. And then once I get network connectivity, once the heartbeats come back, I can resynchronize the data objects and then put myself back into active service. And that's it for the updates. Eric? You want to come back?
He'll come back. He's coming. Yeah.
Okay, and I'm hoping that with the headset, it's sounding better.
Much better.
Good. So I just had a stupid, crazy idea, which is, and this is one of those real time, didn't think about it before, so you can say, no, that's stupid. But would anyone be interested in a blockchain implementation of this? Because that would give you a lot of the properties you're looking for with auditability, immutability, all the voting, you know who's who. And for those in the room who say, get rid of governments or service providers, you could do that if you chose. For those in the room who think that only governments can do it, you can enforce that way as well.
Yeah, I've heard that suggestion before and have thought about it as well. I guess the question is that complexity necessary? Maybe that's, I'm not a blockchain expert, so I'm probably not the best person to make that determination, but it's certainly worthy of consideration, I think.
Okay, well, actually, and if the chairs don't mind, Tom or Ben, do you think are there people in the room who'd be interested? I mean, I'd work on it, but only if people would be interested in it.
Eric, Colin Jays here. I'm interested in the sense I already spent some time thinking about this, as probably many people did, but I couldn't convince myself of a solid property it had that made it. It's certainly a lot more complicated, and I couldn't figure out which property it had that was going to make it significantly better than a more sort of straightforward approach. But if somebody had so what I'm saying is, I think the first thing to work on would be a really compelling reason why to take this complexity before pursuing much else.
Sounds good.
Yeah, I had the same result in my evaluation as well.
Tom McGarry. Chris, so we have now the registrar and the registry as actors. I think in general, we think of those as two very different things, that they're not combined, that if you combine anything, the registrar combines with the communication service provider. In this model, though, do you think that the registry and the registrar can be combined?
Well, for this, the registrar would talk the API of DRIP to do updates. So in its logic of how it, manages numbers locally, it would then call the update command to say, hey, I updated this locally and now I need to propagate that change across the registry.
Yeah, I don't necessarily see why you couldn't have, let's say we have 10 registries and, they are combined as registrars, and some of them serve these communication service providers, and this registry over here is a registrar that serves these
You mean like
communication service
the
providers.
business model? Or,
Yeah,
yeah, absolutely. I mean, the registrar and the registry provider probably would mostly be the same, but you know, there's no reason why you couldn't separate those.
John Peterson, and again, not that I think I've got this entirely worked out in my head yet. This is part of work we need to do, but I mean, I guess I think about the registry. The function of having a registry in an architecture like this is, in fact, to manage the uniqueness of the namespace. In other words, to maintain the consistency of the namespace. And so registries necessarily have a scope of authority for a specific set of numbering resources, if we're going to talk about this for telephone numbers.
Right.
Whereas registrars do not.
Right.
And, so I guess, well, I certainly agree. There are models we considered where the registry acts as a registrar. There's nothing that forbids that in the framework. And I mean, I could certainly imagine some PTTs where effectively that's true. And where I can imagine some PTTs where the registrar, and the CSP are one entity for like an entire, segment of the numbering space.
Right.
And like that's just how it works.
Right.
So, I mean, certainly we don't rule any models like that out in this. Exactly how the interfaces fit, though, is an interesting question. Obviously, I think I would love to do in our next passes of these something that more specifically coordinates. We understand better, like how records exist in the system, like what the registrarish role is that is being played. I think it's going to turn out to be more registrarish, I think, how the DRIP servers are allocating these numbering resources.
Yeah, I guess, I don't know, depends what side of the brain you want to think from, but it really should be that anybody, and that's registrar and probably some other actors that interact with a data store, the registry, which is what I'm thinking. The protocol, they should be calling the APIs, and then the APIs will automatically send out these updates and votes and everything else.
Yes.
And then there'll be a consensus, and then everybody will write the data and commit it to all of it. And that sort of should be thought about a little bit automatically beyond the actors in the system. So this is truly about protocol and has really no relationship to the data model or the actors in the system or anything like that. We will have to define who will use this API, I guess.
Right.
Who the consumers are.
Yeah.
And that's probably pretty straightforward. But essentially we assume it doesn't have to be a JSON object, but it can be some blob of data, and that's being updated and
definitely
managed in the registry itself.
I think obviously for the way I look at it from the Terry perspective, the first attractive record format will be JSON, right? And
Exactly.
JWS actually looks quite attractive to me at this point.
Mm.
Right?
Yeah.
Unsurprisingly, so.
Right. As a way to sign it, you mean? Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And that could be the claim as well.
Tom McCarry. Yeah, so I guess, my question was really more about kind of an implementation or how this would be done, probably not really relevant to talking about the actors and the roles and the functions that they do. But
Right.
If you really think about it, in this distributed registry world, probably the communication service provider, the registrar, and the registry will all be one entity. They'll all be the same.
Mhm. But you might have other, the authority may have to communicate to it, or like you said, if there's a bad actor that's changing some records that they shouldn't be, then they may have to clean that up. But do they do that through a registrar, or do they do that directly? Those are the things we need to figure out in the other documents.
Yeah, the roles would kind of
Right.
determine who the authority is talking to at that point. But I just thought it interesting, everybody would kind of combine into one entity, all
Right.
functions. Yeah.
Right.
Thanks.
Anything else? Thanks.
Okay, so we caught up and got ahead of schedule here. What was the next on the agenda?
Just discussion.
This discussion. get to the right place here. Oh, we don't have the agenda. There it is. Okay, so we're in discussion. I think we've got primarily 3 documents that we can talk about and what to do next. As I said earlier, the list is a very lonely place right now. I can count on one hand the number of emails that happened between meetings. Maybe that's a little bit of an exaggeration, but we haven't had a lot of activity. I do think that with the Terry draft, now we have enough meat that we can start hopefully getting some meaningful discussion going. On the modern problem statement draft, I share the view that there's not likely to be many changes coming. We're probably close to working group last call, but from my perspective, we need to get more comments on the list on even just expressions of support before we advance it. I'd open to other opinions on that.
Might want to get a volunteer reviewer.
Okay.
Nothing like a working group last call, get comments.
That's what I was going to say. Yeah, Alyssa
That's
Cooper.
true,
I mean,
that's true.
you know, the parties who've been paying attention are sort of known. So if you issue the working group last call and you get nothing, then that'll tell you something. But at this point, I think it would be justifiable to issue the working group last call and generate reviews that way. You can always do another one if you get a bunch of reviews and it leads to a lot of changes.
Sure. Then I guess the first step would be to ask for, do we have consensus in the room here to advance it to working group last call, right? I can't make that decision unilaterally. AD thinks we should do it, but do we have any objections? Anybody who doesn't think we should advance the document? And I'll take that same question to the list then also. Hearing no objections, okay. Then the next document is Terry, and I think I mean it's fairly new. We no need to.
It's kind of like there's stuff I know I need to fix.
Right. So I think the goal there would be for the next meeting that it would be ready to become a working group document.
I mean, again, I think, John Peterson, I think we want to have at least one thing that we're doing with it enough that I feel like it's concrete enough in my head that it works. Given what we see on this agenda here, I think that's strict. So, I mean, I think I'll try to figure out with Chris between now and then, you know, a better story of kind of how we think the Terry records would align with what we're going to share in DRIP. And again, we probably look at some Jose-based strategy for doing a binding and encoding for those. And yeah, I think we had that, and we had some practical thing that we're kind of showing this is what could be done with this. I think it might be easier just for people to wrap their head around it, I'm sure, because it is very abstract, intentionally so, right? I think having something that's a little more concrete might make it easier for people to see whether they like it or they hate it.
Okay. I think that's all we have. Anybody have anything else they want to discuss?
If we have time, I was thinking this before, but in terms of telephone ownership versus like routing, like who's routing, do we have anything in there about that?
Boy, do we ever. I mean, so in some sense, this goes back to what the problem framework stuff is too, because this gets into owner versus, owner versus assignee versus delegates versus, and this is again somewhere where we have to tread a bit carefully because we don't want to make assumptions that are not going to apply to, you know, various jurisdictions that actually handle those things very differently. But at a high level, yeah, I mean, I think we understand. But I'm tempted to ask you make the question more specific, right? In the sense, I can say a lot about how I see the assignee, the authority, the owner, and the router. The retrieval interface is going to operate on the service data that is present in Terry records. I mean, imagine the management interface would actually like provision, right? What that service data would be. So the Terry record is going to give you the information you need to do routing. And that routing information, like all Terry records, is predicated on some authority who generates it. Exactly who that authority is, the model is intentionally very broad about, because we imagine that's going to work in a plurality of different environments in different ways. The most common use case we probably care about is one where a communication service provider is the authority because they were allocated these either as a registrar, directly from the registry, or perhaps through another registrar if you're like a service bureau or something like that. And as a consequence of that, they're going to be an authority who could generate one of these records. And again, imagine it like it's a Jose object, right, of some form. And that Jose object will just have some data in it. It'll have some claims in it. And those claims would contain the service data, would contain the data you need for routing. And so when you want to acquire it, yeah, you would have some kind of service, and you'd be able to pose that service a relatively rich question. Since this has a whole bunch of different search properties. And this is where we get into the enum and what it is to try to replace enum with this. We want to create a much richer search environment for it, and a much richer response environment for it. So does that free association answer at least some of your question? Or
I think so. I mean, just thinking about the delegation part, because you can delegate the telephone number usage, and you can delegate who's routing for you, and I just wonder how complex that'll get, or if we need.
I think it's optional in the model, and if people have to it's something that we've designed the model to accommodate, but it's not essential to the model to operate that way. Right? So you can have these delegations, but if those delegations are not, practically speaking, useful for a deployment environment, then they're not going to be exercised. Again, these are largely policy questions, right, of whether it's meaningful to delegate this to someone and to grant them the authority to be able to provide service or administrative data. Those are policy decisions, and we explicitly don't make them with these tools, or only making the tools themselves. And they'll be instantiated through some profile with some particular policy that people want to use them for.
Yeah, maybe that's the answer, because we could go down lots of rat holes there.
Rich, did you have a comment?
It would be a waste of time. No, in one sense. John, would you please do me a favor? This is Rich Shockey. Would you just bury the term enum in this context once and for all? I personally, this is a personal issue for me, I'd never want to hear the term ever again for the rest of my natural life.
The former routing infrastructure that will not be named here.
We call it the retrieval operation, though I'm sure I could find a way to get that into 4 letters that are right. Yeah, so we could probably get Nero or something like that from it.
I could think of something involving S, but I don't really want to in polite company. To your larger point, I mean, the issue of providing metadata for routing information, I have always believed, and certainly have argued on the list on an endless amount of bases, is actually the appropriate use case for deployability. The reason I have ranted on endlessly about these kinds of things is not because I object to modern as a general case, is that I actually support modern, but I would just like to see something that is deployable as a first use case versus something that is going to be very, very difficult to fundamentally deal with. The routability function provides both the use case and not to mention the financial incentive to actually get a deployable infrastructure in place one way or the other. And that's why I think the focus of the initial effort of this working group has been seriously, seriously misguided.
So, one comment on this, it is interesting. I think it was in Prague in 94 or whatever that was. We had this, because initially I proposed actually to do, initially I proposed to do each of the operations actually in separate documents. So the proposal was basically like, let's do retrieval, right, as like a document, and then we'll do like separate documents for the other things. And the counter argument that was made to that was because we knew the data model was common across them, and that the requests and responses for each of the operations was going to share all these just, the source, all the things that you saw me enumerate up there. The argument is, wait, no, don't. I think Henning actually made the argument, please don't waste time doing this in separate documents. Like, do this in one document, defines all the operations, and like, but that does not mean that when we talked about, say, a case like drip, if we were to do this as like a concrete instantiation of that we couldn't focus that on the retrieval part as we built out that use case. I mean, I won't name protocols that should not be. Can I say drinks? Or is that another thing that if I say that I'm allowed to say drinks? Okay. Yes. Yeah. If you need to ban drinks, Richard, neither you nor I will be at this conference ever again.
It's another working group that I screwed up. So I certainly understand.
Yeah, and I screwed Spearmint up, right? So it's there's plenty of blame go around. But I mean, if you look at drinks again, I think so much the problem with drinks was that it was misaligned with what we thought the retrieval interface for it should be. And having something where we can actually figure out how to provision this at the same time as we're figuring out how to retrieve it, and that they're operating on a common object that has a common information model was really a whole value proposition of trying to charter this and structure it this way. So in some ways, I hesitate to say, let's only look at retrieval and not care about what it means to provision this, because we need to have at least enough of a vision of what the records are, which I try to cast as the atomic building block of the entire architecture of the working group. That we know that we're going to be provisioning and retrieving the same stuff, and it's not just going to be completely misaligned how we do that.
Rich Shockey again, the problem that you're postulating, though, does in fact deal with the boil the ocean issue here. I mean, how far do you want to go, or is the retrieval issue just enough where you can actually get consensus towards something that would draw in enough multiple players to which you can actually get something done? Problem is, by dealing with the sort of isolated issues that you dealt with that I have objected to over time, I think you sandboxed yourself into a circumstance where it becomes more difficult to get wider industry sort of consensus on how to solve problems.
Yeah, and I do hear you, Richard, and I understand that choosing to look at this from a life cycle perspective is much more complicated than just looking at retrieval. Again, these are hums we took. You leave or remain. You don't go back to Brexit for another try on the same consensus calls. I mean, unless there's some. I guess, do you disagree with the fundamental philosophical point I made? I know you hate philosophical points, though. That it's really the record that matters. All this stuff about how you retrieve it and these kinds of things, like that's not the hard part of this. The question of whether you're pulling it or pushing it or making it or deleting it, that the operations that do that are like fundamental web operations that like are so well understood. It's not even protocol work for us. It's just like pointing to existing work to specify that part. The only part of this that matters is if we get the record contents itself right. And in that question, if you look at it like if you only look at the question of what needs to be in the record from the question of what the retrieval of that is, then I think we do unfortunately walk the same mistakes that led us into drinks and other things that can't be named, and we get to that misalignment. So that is what motivated us to go down this path. Now, right or wrong, I don't think it's ocean boiling in the sense that. I think if you don't understand enough about how to provision this information, you really aren't going to understand enough about what people need to retrieve either. They're too fundamentally linked. And I don't know a way to do this other than this that isn't simply going to walk us through the mistakes that led us down a very bitter path, right? I mean, that with a lot of hard edges on it.
Rich Shockey again. You're actually correct. I have a moral dislike for philosophical arguments. I have a tremendous appreciation for deployability, namely what can actually be done within a reasonable period of time, given the way the IETF tends to unfortunately operate at these days. So consequently, if boil the ocean has been a problem that I thought drinks clearly demonstrated the issue with, which is if you're going to look at the data object that drinks was trying to deal with, it was very, very difficult to come up with just sort of data object. A reasonable laser focus on a specific use case that is deployable makes lots and lots of things happen, which is frankly what we demonstrated yesterday, in STIR, which is we know what the problem statement is. It's highly narrow. We are willing to live with ambiguity within the basic protocol documents, and we can actually get stuff done out the door and fix little problems in other areas that could be done through consensus profiles.
Okay. Martin would like me to make the offer so he can then criticize my offer. No, so seriously, I would be happy to do this, Richard. If what you want to do is pick your use case, right? Which the management for NNI, right? And say, we're going to take what's in Terry and we're going to have a separate document that's going to be like, here's how we address that with those tools. It's not going to say anything about acquisition, right? It's going to be a document that just is about how you do that management. And I think you want retrieval as well for that, right? Yeah, so it's going to be how you exercise the management and retrieval options of this. And what we'll do is we'll go through and we'll figure out exactly what the data sets are that you guys need for that. And we'll define these JWT objects or whatever it's going to be that's appropriate to your use case that has.
Well, I'm just emphasizing, so long as it's clear that the data objects that would be necessary for NNI interfaces are ultimately extensible.
Of course. We're not going to do all that. If you are willing to work on that, and because I'm not going to do it for you, if you're willing to work on it with me, and I hope Chris would be willing to work on that, it's at least vaguely interesting to you as well. Maybe some other people that are in the NNI task force, I would be happy to make that our next deliverable in this, right? Let's get a milestone for that and say, we're going to apply this model in this instance, only in those two things, but here's something, if you think that's deployable, that's something we can take on as the industry, I got your back. Let's do it. I'd be happy to do that.
Okay, so Martin Dolly, and this is definitely my opinion, not the other, what I usually say after my name, and that is after chairing, the task force through the painful discussion of NNI solutions to come up with nothing, and the thought of exchanging Excel spreadsheets for interconnecting IP. Now I can say my company's name. AT&T is bloody ludicrous. But with that said, when we look at like STIR and how STIR, we reached a conclusion on a common ground, a large part of that had to do with an agency called the FCC, providing the push for everybody. And I think here it's unfortunately going to be the same thing. There's going to have to be a push by some authority in order to get the work, going in a direction where everybody says, yes, now I understand. Versus, I think now, it's wide open to meet all the use cases, and that's fine. But eventually, there needs to be that focal.
Pick what?
Let me comment on this. I think somebody said earlier here actually that they were a member of the North American Numbering Council, and that if they were interested.
Really? Well, I cannot officially speak for Chairman Kane of the North American Numbering Council, but the larger issue of how the NNI deploys is, of course, well-known decisions of the FCC one way or other, and anything that ultimately optimizes that, based, by the way, on last week's further notice of proposed rulemaking on the decommissioning of the PSTN, certainly would be of some interest.
This is Chris Went. I was just going to say, should we wait for the chicken or the egg? we can get something. I don't think there's a lot of real disagreement about what the data model should be. And I think even if we take the one use case, a lot of the other use cases will probably fit pretty closely into that. So to me, it's, let's give it a go. And maybe if the model exists, then the push might come after that as well.
And again, I don't mean to keep John Peterson again, doing the history lesson about how this all started, right? But
Been there, done that.
right. I mean, so it's not like that wasn't what forced me to stand in the front of this room being berated about this for the last 2 years was that, right? So it's not like that is like absent from this consideration. And I think if nothing was happening here, if it was clear there was a problem, I'm sure that we'd be, yeah. I don't want to allude to the various paths of communication that have come down on us over STIR, right? But if we're not getting it done, people do tend to complain to us about it. So, yeah, I mean, but in all seriousness, man, I got time for you on this. If you're willing to, because I'm not going to do this myself though. I'm not going to stand up here at the front of this room forever, to have tomatoes thrown at me on this. If there are people in this room that want to see something that's done, I'll take what use case you want, and I will show you how we can do that with this if we can work on it together.
There needs to be some more discussion about this, obviously. But logically, again, as I said earlier, this is Rich Shockey again. What I said earlier was, I have and have had a strong belief that your original Turk proposal, and this in general, represented an appropriate framework for the storage and retrieval of metadata involving telephone numbers. And for all the reasons that we have known for the last 15 years, et cetera, et cetera. So the problem I had is every time I see the way the IETF is trying to proceed on this, is the lack of specificity and the lack of a demonstrable use case, tends to delay getting people directly involved, and B, actually coming up with a reasonable solution that can be built on success. Okay. As I have argued, the NNI metadata use case, as well as some of the other use cases that the other gentleman had pointed out, are clear and demonstrable. And instead of continuing to have a mailing list, which no one wants to participate in, versus a mailing list that actually comprises service providers who would actually have to deploy some of this sort of stuff, it might actually be useful, that's one, but maybe two would be helpful.
Okay, we're running out of time, so I'll let Alyssa close this down.
Actually, overtime, so I guess I get the last word. All I was going to say was that, the way the IETF works is right now is not so different from how it's worked in the past. People want to do stuff, write a draft. People want to join a mailing list, they're all open. So, I'm sorry?
We know.
Okay, but it seems like that's the thing that's missing here to me. I would love to see these drafts that have been discussed today. I think they would really help move the discussion forward, and they don't exist right now. So maybe we'll see them before Korea.
Can the chair just ask if they think this is a good plan for
Ask.
The plan is that, sorry.
We're waiting for Richard to help you write something? No, I don't feel it's
The plan is that we would aim actually to have a new deliverable for the working group effectively. And that new.
You don't need a milestone to write a draft. It's an individual draft. We do not need to adopt another milestone in this working group. What we need this working group to do is to do some work. So to demonstrate some interest. Individual draft, see what happens.
And we'll go from there.
That
And
we will
really
produce
do-
an individual draft on this, right? That will try to capture this specific use case.
Yeah, we don't need agreement in the group to do that.
No, but I
It
want
can
to know
happen.
that there's enough. Look, I've wasted a lot of time writing these things, right? If we're not going to do this, I'm not going to write anymore. If the people in this room want this and there's some energy to do it, I'm happy to do it. If there's not, I'm going to go home. I said this last time, I'm saying it again. So if you're in, you want to see this done, you say it's a real problem, I will help you solve that problem. Would the working group like us to do this or not?
Why don't we take this to the list, John?
We're out of time. We got people taking the room. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Oh, yeah. Sorry, we opened up a controversial topic right at the very end there. Microphone still. I don't know how to turn it off. I was looking for Mary, but I couldn't find it.
Hi, yeah.